Yes.
Amen.
This is a great day to be sharing and reading the second book of Peter. For we did not follow cleverly devised myths when we made known to the power and the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we had been eyewitness to this majesty. For we received honor and glory from God, the Father, when that voice was conveyed to him by the majestic glory, saying, "This is my Son, my beloved, with whom I'm well pleased." We ourselves heard this voice come from heaven while we were with him in the holy mountain. So we have the prophetic message fully confirmed. You will do well to be attentive to this as a lamp shining in a dark place until the day dawns and the morning star rises in your heart. First of all, you must understand this, that no prophecy of Scripture is a matter of one's own interpretation, because no prophecy ever came by human will, but men and women, moved by the Holy Spirit, spoke from God. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Would you pray with me? Let the words of my mouth and the meditations of our heart be acceptable to you, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen.
Amen.
Hear now this reading from the Gospel according to Matthew. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and his brother John, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became a dazzling white. Suddenly there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make 3 dwellings here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud a voice said, "This is my Son, the Beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell to the ground and were overcome by fear. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, "Get up and do not be afraid." And when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus ordered them, "Tell no one about the vision until after the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." The word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God. Amen.
Well, today is Transfiguration Sunday, the day that we celebrate the revelation of Christ's glory. Transfiguration Sunday is always the last Sunday of Epiphany. Epiphany itself is a season dedicated to the illumination of Christ's glory, Christ's divinity. But have you ever wondered why we have this season of illumination right before Lent, which is a season of repentance? The color is purple. We put ashes on our forehead. There's this sense of brooding and maybe even darkness. Why do we have this contrast of seasons? We celebrate the Transfiguration right before the Passion, so that we might be strengthened to bear our cross and be changed into his likeness. During Lent, we renew our commitment to walking in the way of the cross, and we remind ourselves and each other that when we were baptized, we made a promise to God to renounce all evil and sin and to walk with Christ daily. Easter is when the full glory of Christ is revealed, but it is foreshadowed in the transfiguration. And this reminds us that we share not only the way of the cross with Christ, but not only in the dying with Christ, but also in the revelation, in the resurrection of Christ. That is the promise of Easter. Now, in the Gospel of Matthew, just as in Mark and Luke, the transfiguration serves as a kind of bridge between Jesus' public ministry and his passion. From the time of the transfiguration, Jesus sets his face toward Jerusalem and the cross. The transfiguration story lies right about in the middle of Matthew's gospel. It's about halfway between his baptism and his resurrection. So in more ways than one, the transfiguration story is at the heart of Matthew's gospel. In this story, Jesus is transfigured before Peter, James, and John. His clothes become a dazzling white. I like what you said, Coach, about it being like lightning. It's bright and white as lightning. They were almost unable to see. They were blinded by the light. But they are just able to make out two other figures standing there. Somebody got that? Standing there in the light with Jesus. The law and the prophets, Moses and Elijah, these two great figures that represent the pillars of Judaism, Moses and Elijah, the law and the prophets. And all three of them are enveloped in this cloud. And then out of this cloud there comes a voice. This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him. Listen to him. That is, believe what he has just told them about the Son of Man and how he must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the scribes and the chief priests and the elders and be killed. And then on the third day to rise again. Listen to him and believe. Now in the passage that comes right before the one that I read this morning, that's what Jesus tells them. And this is the disciples' reaction. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, God forbid it, Lord. This must never happen to you. And for this, Peter gets the strongest rebuke that anyone receives in the New Testament. Jesus turns to Peter and he says, Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. And now a voice from heaven is telling Peter, James, and John that this must be so, not only for the Messiah, but also for those who follow him. Neither God the Father nor Jesus the Son ever explains why this must be so. And neither of them ever explains what cross-bearing means for us non-Messiahs. They never explain that. In the entire Gospels, no reason is ever given why this must be so. It seems that even Jesus doesn't know the reason why all this must happen. He just knows that it must happen. And with his last breath, as he's dying on the cross, he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? The necessity of the passion is left a mystery for us. It is hidden in the mind of God the Father. But if the reason is hidden, then from the perspective of history, its inevitability is obvious. Jesus' devotion to the reign of God on earth provoked the powers that be. The fear, the hatred, the greed, the falsehood, violence and despair, these forces that rule the lives of many people. And Jesus provoked these evil powers. And they responded, as they always do, with oppression and murder. Ironically, their evil reaction, though, revealed to us all the triumphant power of God's nonviolent love. In the Transfiguration, we are invited to listen to him. We are invited to walk the way of the cross with Jesus. And we know that to follow in his footsteps is to provoke the powers in the same way that Jesus did. But it's also to reveal the eternal truth and trustworthiness of God's inclusive love and justice, even in the midst of evil. Now, to be sure, walking the way of the cross is not the same for each of us. We each have a unique cross to bear. So, bearing your cross doesn't mean just one thing, but it's important to be clear about what it does not mean. There are several things that bearing a cross does not mean. It does not mean that we should seek out suffering. And we should not regard it as having the power to save us. Suffering does not have the power to redeem us. Suffering is not salvation. Jesus did not die so that his suffering would purge the world of evil and sin. He died because the powers of evil sought to silence his witness to nonviolent love, his witness to inclusion, his witness to justice and the truth. Now, his passion revealed not only the evil powers of his day, but also the transforming power of divine love. Divine love that is powerful and assertive, but which does not dominate or defeat evil so much as it challenges it and exposes it for what it really is, wherever it lurks, and then seeks to transform it. It's this kind of love that saves, that redeems us. So the way of the cross is not to seek out suffering. That's not what the way of the cross is. Neither is it a passive love that seeks to avoid all evil. It's not a private sacrifice, silently bearing woes so that we earn Jesus' favor and another star, another diamond in our crown. That's not what bearing your cross means. Divine love is vigorous. It's an assertive pursuit of not only personal holiness, but also social holiness. John Wesley said, there is no holiness without social holiness. Divine love refuses to play the world's power game of domination and exploitation, of greed and deception. So the Transfiguration story is a call for us to affirm God's way of salvation and to begin living it in our own lives. The Transfiguration story invites us to believe with all our heart, mind, and soul that Jesus' inclusive way is the way of salvation, of healing, of wholeness, and of eternal life. The story of the Transfiguration reveals Jesus' divinity and his place over and above the law and the prophets, symbolized by Moses and Elijah. And yet this divinity is not on public display. You notice that. Who does he take with him? Just the three favorites, Peter, James, and John. And they're way up on a mountain where there's nobody else around to see them. And then, just to be sure, they're all enveloped in a cloud. The event happens with only a couple of witnesses. Now, throughout the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus persistently attempts to keep his identity as the Messiah a secret. Did you ever notice that? You ever wonder why? I think it's because the divinity of Christ is not a matter of public record. It's only known by those to whom God has chosen to reveal it. Do you know that Jesus is the Messiah? Well, be happy about that, because God has chosen to reveal that to you. And you'll often hear Christians make claims about Jesus' divinity as though it were a well-known fact that anyone could understand if they would just look at the evidence. Lee Strobel's book, The Case for Christ, is a prime example. In it, he lays out clearly the case for Christ's divinity, just like a lawyer in a courtroom, which is great reading for Christians. It confirms our beliefs. It tells us that what we understand, what we know is right. But it's not going to convince anyone that God hasn't already chosen to reveal this secret to. The knowledge that Jesus is God's divine Son is a matter of revelation. And it comes in God's own way and time. It is a gift from God. It is not something that we possess. It's not something which gives us power or makes us superior to others. We should be humbled by this knowledge. Knowing the secret of Jesus' identity does not make us little gods with power to rule the world. Like Peter, we want that to be true. We want to rule the world with this knowledge. We want to make little tabernacles so that our little egos can stay and bask in the glory of Jesus as though it were our own glory. But the Gospel of Matthew will have nothing to do with such idolatry. Jesus' mission was not to make a big deal of himself or to elevate his followers to positions of power and authority because of their close association with him. Jesus' mission was to point beyond himself to God and the coming of God's reign on earth, and then to invite his followers to do the same. High on a mountain, in a moment of luminous splendor, Jesus was clothed in the dazzling light of God, but only briefly, and only to a very select few. Heaven was revealed in that moment, only to be veiled again on the cross. It was unveiled again, not in a glorious public resurrection appearance, but by an empty tomb, to a lonely figure, announcing his resurrection and return to Galilee, only to a select few. The Transfiguration story reminds us to speak the truth in love, with humility and reverent mystery, to take up our cross, perhaps to evoke the responses of the evil powers of this world, but to do so, like Jesus, humbly, without violence, without an air of superiority, but humbly and assertively, to love our neighbors, to seek our own personal holiness, and also holiness for the world in which we live, to love our neighbors and seek social holiness, claiming our part in heaven and in the resurrection and in the kingdom of God.
Amen.
In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.